across January through this Sunday, with the rest of the church around the world, we've been reading through Mark's stories of the early ministry of Jesus. Each Sunday we've gotten a story about Jesus' baptism or the calling of disciples. And now we're at these two stories of Jesus in Capernaum, a little village by the side of the Sea of Galilee. And last week we really got the first part of this story. It's today and last Sunday, the two stories come together in one day. I'm intrigued by the fact that this is one day in the life of Jesus. It starts with him on the Sabbath, going into the synagogue. And you may remember, if you were here last week, a man with an unclean spirit cries out in the synagogue and declares knowledge of who Jesus is. The disciples don't have that yet. They don't seem to be able to acquire it until after the resurrection. But he calls Jesus the Holy One. I know who you are, Jesus, he calls out the unclean spirit. You're the Holy One of God. I point it out because it's the same title that's in the Isaiah passage we just read. Did you catch that? It refers to the Holy One there. And Jesus casts out that unclean spirit, and then after the synagogue, he now goes, I'm calling it to lunch, to Sabbath lunch. And its story picks up right here. As soon as they left, verse 29, as soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now, Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. In the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." He answered, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came out to do." And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This passage, this day, is chock-a-block full with elements of Jesus' life and his character, much more here than we could work through probably in a whole month itself. But I want to point out on this Communion Sunday at least three things that I've found in the passage this week as I lived with it and talked with many people in this congregation about it. And the first one is this: Jesus heals. He restores. When he heals, he restores. Peter's mother had a fever. Simon is Peter here, Simon Peter. And his mother-in-law had a fever. And the story doesn't say from what. In that region, I think malaria is certainly a leading possibility. It still continues in Africa to be very much a danger now. So that seems reasonable to me that it could have been malaria. But Jesus healed her. And when he healed her, the text says she got up and served, meaning she served the meal to the people in that household. Now note, it's the Sabbath and he heals her. And Jesus gets in trouble for this. It's not the social order to do this kind of healing work or any work on the Sabbath. Nevertheless, he does it. He heals her, and as a part of that, he touches her. So he's touching an unclean person, a sick person on the Sabbath, and then he's served by her. He lets her serve him, which also wouldn't have been a part of the social order to be that close to someone that sick so soon. The text is clear, and this story is repeated in the other Gospels. The text is clear in this detail, that she's a woman and she was a sick woman. And the social code is that he should not on this day touch or engage with her. But from the beginning of his ministry, Jesus makes it clear that he values relationship, compassion, care for all, in home and in the community also, the wider community. Now, I want to acknowledge that when we read this story in 2024, as people who are living in this modern time, there's almost always some indignation. Indignation about, people across the whole generational spectrum and across genders here. Indignation about Peter's mother-in-law having to go from being so sick with a fever that she's confined to bed to rising immediately and going to work, serving everybody in the household. I acknowledge that. Hear what the New Testament scholar Fame Perkins says in her commentary on Mark. I like quoting Fame Perkins because she came here and spoke once. She was one of our resurrection speakers probably 25 years ago now, and I got to take her to breakfast. We had pancakes together. And so I like reading about her. She wrote this commentary after she came here and spoke. I don't think I was any influence on her over pancakes, but it really is a personal memory for me. But she says this about Peter's mother-in-law serving here. Peter's mother-in-law lies racked with fever. She cannot fulfill the role of preparing and serving a meal to the guests, which would have fallen to her as the senior woman in the household. Jesus' healing restores her to her social position in the household. Jesus restores. His healing restores. Many people today, says Dr. Perkins, react negatively to the picture of a woman getting up after a severe illness to serve male guests. Jesus, James, John, Andrew. This sentiment hardly seems appropriate to the complex gender and social roles involved in this household. Certainly, Peter's wife or a female servant may have prepared food, also as a part of helping. But here, Mark is clear, the privilege of showing hospitality to important guests falls to Peter's mother-in-law as a matter of honor, not as a matter of servitude. Mark is making the point Jesus restored her to her position of influence and authority in that household. Jesus again and again chooses compassion over and against the norms of the social order. The story is showing us evidence that not only is she healed and fully healed, but she is restored to her healthy self, to her position and activity. Perkins points out, we exhibit similar behavior still. When special guests are expected for dinner, no one gets near the kitchen without clearance from the person who has the privilege and the responsibility of preparing the food. And that's my own experience. I'll attest to that. I've nearly had my hand cut off with a chopping knife a couple of times. The memory here teaches us that still in the beginning, in the first chapter of Mark's gospel, in the beginning of Jesus' ministry, that Jesus heals, restoring people to the service of one another. God restores us to the service of one another. That's what we're called to do, to serve one another and the community around us. It's a faithful response. Different calls of service. Everyone isn't called to serve the meal. Some are. There are other acts of service. But when Jesus calls us and restores us, it's to that work of serving in some way, the home and the community and the world. Christ serves the world. If we, like the demon-possessed man in the synagogue last week, who was restored to his rightful place of worshiping person in the community, or Peter's mother-in-law this week, who's restored to her place in the home, if we are healed and restored by Christ, what is it we're being restored to? For what service, what act of service, are you being restored to by Christ? Point 2, Jesus prays. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is seen explicitly in this kind of intense prayer just 3 times. One is here in the first chapter at the beginning of his ministry where it's being defined. The other is in the middle when he performs the miracle of the feeding of 5,000 and he goes up on a mount to pray by himself. And it's also in the conclusion in the Garden of Gethsemane in a time of great challenge where he goes to pray. They are all 3 critical moments. In critical and intense moments of stress and even concern, Jesus prays. And the setting for each of these 3 prayers in some way finds Jesus going to solitude apart from the busy hours of the day. The story teaches us, and we may take it for granted, but the story doesn't, that Jesus prays and that prayer was important to Jesus. In his own life here, in this day, Jesus exemplifies a rhythm of work, rest, and prayer. In this very passage he does. He prays after a fairly intense evening of healing. Verse 32, that evening after the sun was down, while they're still in this house, they brought sick and evil-afflicted people to him. The whole city lined up at his door. He cured their sick bodies and tormented spirits. Prayer is in part meant to be for us a gift towards a means of restoration. How do times of challenge, how do intense times of concern affect you? Do they send you to prayer in restorative recovery? Jesus' disciples here see no need on his part to interrupt a very successful initial community engagement with a prayer retreat. When they can't find him, they go looking for him and they say to him, what are you doing out here? There's all of these sick people that still need to be healed. They're not valuing this time apart for prayer very much. Like the disciples, we consistently, Mark is telling us, undervalue the effectiveness and the helpfulness of prayer. So we get this example. Jesus believed in prayer, and you can tell it because he practiced it. He practiced what he preached. And here, he preaches by his practice as well. And I don't want you to think that I think this text is teaching us that we should give up sleep in order to pray. I don't think that's true. I think sleep is a gift from God. I think in our humanity, God gives us sleep also to restore us. I think sometimes I pray in my sleep. I think dreams are important and rest is important. The text says here, Jesus got up, which means he went down. He went down to sleep, all right, at point, and then rose from that. And remember, they're not living with electric lights in their houses, so they're going to bed earlier when it gets dark, and they're rising earlier. And that's consistent with my experience with Christian communities in third world countries today. Jesus got up, which means that he laid down. This is not about sleep deprivation towards personal piety, but rather it's about choosing prayer even in solitude, over and against always being personally accessible. Don't you think so? He could have stayed there and healed more people, but he goes off. Everybody doesn't get healed in this story, in part because he's taking time to go off by himself and pray. Jesus obviously disappoints a lot of people in his choosing prayer over consistent personal accessibility. He's not performing miracles or healing when he's alone, but Jesus practiced and prioritized prayer. Point 3, last point. This story shows us a time when Jesus leaves. I do not think that people in Capernaum wanted Jesus to leave. They're clamoring outside the door for his attention and his help. There was still work to do, but after prayer, Jesus discerns that God's call in his life requires him to move on, to leave that particular place and its residents, and to move on toward another. What does Ecclesiastes tell us? To everything there is a time and a season, a time to arrive and a time to leave. Except Ecclesiastes doesn't say that. A time to arrive and a time to leave is not one of the 28 times listed in Ecclesiastes. Be careful about what other people assure you is a fact from the Bible. That's why you have to read your Bible yourselves. That's why we print it in the bulletin, because we're called to read it and become familiar with it ourselves. I like the graphic that shares the quote, "Everything you read in the internet isn't true," attributed to Abraham Lincoln. Ecclesiastes 3 doesn't say explicitly there's a time to arrive and a time to leave, but I think it implies it. In a time for every season. And Jesus here in Mark's gospel intentionally chooses to leave the village of Capernaum. Verse 37, when they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." And he answered, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came out to do." Jesus leaves Capernaum to focus on God's call. We've talked quite a bit this month about God's calling us in the stories of Jesus in his early ministry. Is Jesus calling you out of something? Not just calling you to pick up something new, but to put something aside now, to put something down. as a way of being faithful to him. Jesus answered, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came to do." Jesus restores, Jesus prays, Jesus leaves. This brings an end to Mark's early stories on the ministry of Jesus. The great glory of transfiguration and the pilgrimage of Lent are ahead. Let us practice now following Jesus by serving this holy meal given to us by the Holy One. Amen.